Today is December 8th, 2024. The Syrian government has reportedly collapsed in Damascus. This is after days of the Syrian Arab army withdrawing from territory that it had held for years following the Russian intervention, the freezing of the conflict. The conflict was frozen. U.S. forces in eastern Syria, Turkish forces occupying northern Syria. It was frozen with the understanding that this would all move toward eventual peace, some sort of resolution and peace. But in reality, and this is the reality of any sort of agreement made with the collective West, freezing a conflict is only going to give the collective West time to rearm, regroup, and relaunch hostilities. This is exactly what has happened. The Syrian Arab army fought heroically to retake territory, major cities, Hama, Homs, Aleppo, Palmyra, areas in the south toward the border with Jordan. But they were a spent force. The conflict was frozen. And apparently nothing was done to even sustain Syria's fighting capacity, let alone expand it. And this is not necessarily the Syrian Arab army's fault or even the Syrian government's fault. I want to play this clip of Dana Stroll of the U.S. Department of Defense at a talk at the U.S. government and arms industry funded think tank CSIS, and she explained exactly why the U.S. was occupying eastern Syria, what the purpose of it all was. Let's listen.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests, and we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. There were three other areas of leverage. One is political and diplomatic isolation of the Assad regime. This is, in our assessment, one of Russia's goals in the Middle East is the propaganda win for Russia of rehabilitating Assad on the international stage, of basically forcing the international community to normalize him and welcome him back in without any behavioral changes. So holding the line on diplomatic isolation, preventing embassies from going back into Damascus. Two is the economic sanctions architecture. So some of this is part of the maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration on Iran, but there's a whole suite of both executive and congressional sanctions on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, both for human rights abuses in Syria and to the backers of Assad for their activities in support of him in Syria. And three was reconstruction aid. So the United States remains the overall largest single donor of humanitarian aid to Syrians both inside Syria and refugees outside of Syria. And there was some stabilization assistance in the part of Syria that was liberated from ISIS and controlled via the Syrian Democratic Forces in northern eastern Syria. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
So basically, she's admitting that the whole point of the U.S. staying in eastern Syria was not to work out some sort of peace agreement with the Syrian government or with Russia or Iran. It was to maintain pressure on Syria, to freeze and starve the Syrian people into submission, to hollow out the economy, to prevent reconstruction, to prolong human suffering, to perpetuate this ongoing crime against humanity that the U.S. has been in the process of committing all across the Middle East, including in Syria, until Syria finally collapsed. And that appears to be what has finally happened. Now, this brings us to the United States' larger global strategy. It is to overextend not just Syria, not to hollow out and collapse Syria, but this was part of a wider strategy to overextend and collapse the Russian Federation. And this all goes back to this 2019 paper published by the RAND Corporation literally titled, Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. And if you look at the table of contents, it spells it out very clearly where the United States was going to light geopolitical fires, force Russia to invest, and hopefully overextend it, precipitating a Soviet Union-style collapse. Measure 1, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. We can see where this has led Russia in terms of its special military operation, now spanning 3 years. Measure 2, increase support to the Syrian rebels. Measure 3, promote regime change in Belarus. Measure 4, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus, where the U.S. is right now backing violent protesters trying to overthrow the government of Georgia. Measure 5, reduce Russian influence in Central Asia. Measure 6, challenge Russian presence in Moldova. And as you can see, Russia is attempting to address all of these areas. But if they were to overcommit in one of these areas, it might cost them in all of these areas. And so they are forced to look at the disposition, the true disposition of their forces, what they have available to invest, and where they need to invest it. They need to prioritize it. It may not necessarily be realistic for them to commit to all of these areas where the U.S. is attempting to overextend Russia. They felt that committing too much to Syria, leave them vulnerable, and possibly cost them in Ukraine, they would make the decision to cut Syria loose. The same goes for Iran, for that matter. We have to understand how precarious the state Syria was left in and the inability of anything being able to be done about it. We just listened to Dana Stroll from the U.S. Department of Defense explain how the U.S. was deliberately strangling Syria economically. There are limits to what Russia, Iran, China, and the rest of the multipolar world can do. People say, where is China? China, despite being accused by the U.S. of being a global threat, it literally lacks the ability to project military power around the globe. Its military is built up and designed specifically to defend Chinese territory. In order to build the capabilities required to project military power around the globe, it would require years and years of investment. People take for granted America's ability to do this. That is a capability they built up over decades and decades, and we can see how it has left them, in a sense, overextended and vulnerable. So please keep this bigger picture in mind. When looking at the collapse of Syria, understand that this is one battle within a much larger war. You have to remember that, and you have to remember there is nothing final about the collapse of Syria. Yes, the current government is gone, is unlikely to ever come back, but the idea of a sovereign Syrian state, perhaps with a government even better, with prospects better than the Syria that we saw leading up to this collapse, could emerge. We remember Russia having to make a very difficult decision in 2011 not to come to the aid of Libya, because at that time they were not prepared or able to. They would have overextended themselves. They are, however, involved in Libya right now. They're involved in a lot of areas they weren't able to involve themselves in before. But again, this all contributes to limits to what they are able to do. And those limits were reached in Syria and apparently for Iran too. So we have to keep in mind, these are not all powerful nations. Russia is not all powerful. If America, with all of its wealth and power and its military spanning the globe, has limits to its power, so does Russia, so does China, so does Iran. We have to recognize that, be realistic about it. We have to understand that a battle lost is not a war lost, and you have to stay focused on the bigger picture. Now, one thing I will say, as I go to look at the map, you will notice that the information space is 100% monopolized by the U.S. That is their superpower. Their military and industrial power is in irreversible decline, but their ability to politically capture other nations, to commandeer and control a targeted nation's information space, move in and co-opt its education system, to infiltrate and take over its political system. This is America's superweapon. This is something that I have been writing about and doing videos about for years and years. I have tried to raise awareness of the imperative of defending a nation's information space. The final result of failing to protect your nation's information space is this: your country overrun by US-backed opposition groups, by US-backed and armed terrorists, your nation reduced to rubble, your country essentially, for all intents and purposes, erased off the map. The United States did this, not necessarily without firing a single shot, but with minimum involvement by its US military. Yes, its military is occupying eastern Syria and strangling Syria economically. But before they even invaded, they had already infiltrated and overrun Syrian society through information space, through the education system, through institutions, and the political system. Now, let's just go over very quickly what happened. This area up here, northern Syria, was occupied by Turkish troops. They were harboring U.S. armed and backed terrorists there, literal terrorists listed by the U.S. State Department as terrorists. Jabhat al-Nusra, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is what the group is calling itself now. All of these various incarnations of ISIS and al-Qaeda were all being harbored by Turkey in the north and U.S. forces, both east of the Euphrates River, but also down here near the Jordanian, Iraqi, Syrian borders. A U.S. base here, and the U.S. was harboring terrorists listed by the State Department as terrorists here, and you can see how they have gone from this area. Let's look at the timeline. They went from this area that they had been controlling all of these years, and now they are converging on Damascus with other forces emanating out of Jordan. There are U.S. military forces stationed in Jordan. They have, for years and years, been arming and training armies of terrorists who cross over to then go fight in Syria. And you can see how the country was invaded. It's not an uprising. It was an invasion from north, from south, from east, all converging on Damascus. Now, this is what I'm talking about as far as dominating the information space. All of these icons represent claims made of terrorists capturing territory, controlling areas, capturing territory, the Syrian government deteriorating and collapsing. And if you click on any one of these, every single source is either the US-backed terrorists themselves or Western media. And you'll say, well, that's because it's a pro-Western map. Well, let's go to RT, Russian state media. Jihadists claim to take over power in Syria. Islamists entered Damascus and declared it free, asserting President Bashar al-Assad had fled the capital. So let's click on this story. According to Reuters, the Russian Federation has military forces in Syria. They are working directly with the Syrian government for years and years. How does Russia not know what is going on in Syria? Why are they citing Reuters? Why are they doing that? Why don't they know what is happening in Syria? Why doesn't RT have a liaison representing the forces in Syria that can tell them what is going on? Either because they do and they don't want to admit what is going on and they want to kind of leak this information out via Western sources, or because they actually don't know what is going on in Syria. Russian forces almost certainly do know what's really going on. But RT does not know. And this is what I'm talking about. The Western media is an integral part of U.S. intelligence, military, political operations all around the globe. They are directly involved in it. They know exactly what is going on, which is why they're able to fashion the best, most effective lies for any occasion. I do not understand how RT is organized. I have watched RT do this for years and years. Events taking place around the globe, and instead of doing independent research onto what is happening. Sometimes they do, and they do a very good job at it. But oftentimes, if it's an area they're unfamiliar with or they don't usually cover, they defer to Western media coverage. What is the point of creating RT and reaching out to global audiences if all you're going to do is bolster and serve as an extension of Western propaganda? You're supposed to be confronting, exposing the propaganda, not enabling it. So this is the problem that I am talking about. Information space in the 21st century is as important for a nation to protect as a nation's land borders, shores, and airspace. Getting back to the map, people will say, okay, obviously these militants all advance from the borders. I mean, this pro-militant, pro-Western map shows that very clearly. They have a timeline feature. You can watch them emanating out of these US, Turkish, and Jordanian controlled areas converging on Damascus. How do we know that they're actually US-backed terrorists? Because Seymour Hersh, back in 2007, warned the world that the US was investing in, supporting, bolstering extremists across the Middle East to overthrow both the Syrian and Iranian government. And it says here, to undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant version of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, but only superficially. They are an extension of U.S. geopolitical interest around the globe. They are an extremist group created by the U.S. It poses as being adversarial toward the U.S. and also Israel, but in fact, it is benefiting from both U.S. and Israeli, also Turkish and Persian Gulf, money, arms, training, and all other forms of support. That was 2007. Come 2011, the so-called Arab Spring has sprung. And if you research the opposition groups involved carefully, you would have saw all of the U.S. government money flowing to them. And eventually the New York Times admitted all of this by April, as a matter of fact. U.S. groups helped nurture Arab uprisings. And it says down here, a number of the groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House. They say this is according to interviews in recent weeks and American diplomatic cables obtained by WikiLeaks. And they explain that all of those organizations they just listed are subsidiaries of the National Endowment for Democracy. And ultimately, all of this is being funded by the U.S. State Department. And they admit that this was not something that the U.S. co-opted in 2011. They were preparing for it years in advance. They said the opposition leaders attended a 2008 technology meeting in New York where they were taught to use social networking and mobile technologies to promote democracy. Among those sponsoring the meeting were Facebook, Google, MTV, Columbia Law School, and the U.S. State Department. And it wasn't just 2008. It was several years consecutively leading all the way up to 2011. So they prepared for years to create the political diversion, the armed violence they were also preparing would use as a pretext to begin the violent overthrow of all of these targeted nations, not just Syria. Come 2012, there was a leaked U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document. It was published by Judicial Watch. It is right here. The link will be in the video description below. And it says right here, the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Al-Qaeda are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. And then it says down here, the West, which means the United States and Europe, Gulf countries, so the Persian Gulf states, U.S. allies, and Turkey support the opposition, while Russia, China, and Iran support the regime. They are admitting that ISIS and Al-Qaeda, because elsewhere in this document they talk about the creation of a Salafist principality. Salafist is Islamic principality state, Islamic state. Salafist principality, Islamic state. They were talking about the creation of the Islamic State, and they said this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want, and they already identified the U.S., Europe, Turkey, Persian Gulf states as those supporting powers in order to isolate the Syrian regime. So we listened to Dana Stroll of the U.S. Department of Defense say that that was the goal, that had been the goal, and at the time of that talk in 2019, that was still the goal: isolating, hollowing out, undermining, and finally collapsing the Syrian government. So that is what happened. And of course, this most recent offensive, led by HTS, right down here, this is CNN interviewing the head of HTS, Abu Mohammed al-Jalani, the militant leader of the main group driving the country's armed opposition. This is who has overrun Syria. Well, here is HTS listed on the U.S. State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations. So this is a operation to undermine and overthrow the government of Syria, stretching all the way back to 2007 when Seymour Hersh warned that under the Bush administration this was taking shape. It continued under the Obama administration, where the U.S. engineered and launched the so-called Arab Spring, the political instability used as cover for the violent overthrow of many nations, including Syria. Militants that had already been years being prepared by the U.S. It continued under the Trump administration, who maintained the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria specifically to strangle the Syrian government and its people out of existence, to allow these armed terrorists who now under the Biden administration have overrun Syria. So that is the complete arc of this story. So I want to get back to what I think the main problem still is. Even as the multipolar world grows economically, even militarily, surpassing the US and the rest of the collective West in so many ways, they still have not addressed collective security and internal security. While yes, Russia and China have protected their own respective information spaces very well, they have neglected creating any sort of way of aiding their allies and potential partners in protecting their own information space. And if your information space is undefended, the United States can not only monopolize it, they can use it to turn a nation's population against its own best interests, just as they have done in Ukraine. It is a slow festering inside a nation. The U.S. spends millions and millions of dollars every single year, gathering just a few more people each year, working for them, and each person is working to expand their reach within the targeted country until it reaches critical mass. And you have a large segment of the population willing to vote in a US-backed opposition party into power, where they can then start making institutional changes within the country. And before you know it, political capture has taken place. And if voting cannot create an outcome favorable to U.S. interests, they will just overthrow whatever government is standing in their way, which is what they did in Ukraine in 2014. And they have convinced the Ukrainian people to ignore their best interests, which would be neutrality, working with the West and with Russia, who had been their largest trading partner up until then. That would be their best interest. They have convinced the Ukrainian people to throw away their best interests and to collectively commit national suicide, which is what they are in the process of doing right now. And they have now succeeded in convincing many people in Syria to do this. And they continue undermining nations all around the world. I live in Southeast Asia, in the Kingdom of Thailand. The U.S. right now is at work, year after year after year, building up opposition groups, poisoning a growing percentage of the population against Thailand's own best interests, against their own history, their own culture, their own way of life, and their own indigenous institutions that have prevailed over centuries, protecting the country. They are poisoning them against it, and eventually they will succeed, because having a better, more compelling story is not enough. The United States works in such a way when it is poisoning a population against itself. It is always offering people the path to least resistance. So people will see the promise of doing nothing, getting everything they want, or they will hear their own leaders saying, well, we have to work hard, we have to defend the country, we have to make sacrifices. Most people are going to choose getting something for nothing. Even if it's not true, they would rather believe that than commit to a life of hard work and sacrifice to continue building their country. The only way to stop this from poisoning your country is to get it out of your country. That is the only way, and that is exactly why Russia and China have cleared out their information space of U.S. interference, U.S. propaganda. That is why they did it, because it is always offering a path to less resistance that people will, just by the truth of human nature, that is what people will choose. Russia and China have successfully done this. They need to offer other nations a means of securing and defending their information space in the same way Russia and China offer weapons to all of these countries to defend their physical domains of air, land, and sea. Russia and China could offer nations like Thailand assistance in setting up an English language news agency like RT or like China's CGTN, so that Thailand can get their side of the story out to international audiences to better balance the information war that is constantly taking place. They could also assist nations like Thailand in creating their own social media platforms, because right now inside Thailand and many other countries around the world, most countries around the world, they depend on social media platforms based in the United States, controlled by Silicon Valley and their toxic relationship with the U.S. State Department and the special interests driving U.S. foreign policy. So if everyone in Thailand depends on US-based social media platforms, those US-based social media platforms are going to determine what information can and cannot be shared, what information is promoted, what other information is suppressed. And by doing so, you begin the process of shaping people's opinions, shaping their very values and sense of identity, and they shape it in such a way to serve US interests at the expense of this targeted nation's own actual best interests. The U.S. also infiltrates a nation by creating all sorts of educational programs, targeting the educational system of that country. And they create entire pipelines to take young people, indoctrinate them, train them, give them internships, even send them to the United States or Europe, plug them into the personal and professional networks over there, so that when they return to their home country and they work their way into, say, the media, the legal system, the education system, they represent Western interests. And if they don't, they run the risk of being ostracized from these professional and personal networks the U.S. deliberately plugged them into in the first place. This is how empire has perpetuated itself all throughout human history. The Romans used to take the children of chieftains in areas they were trying to subordinate to the Roman Empire. They would send them back to Rome, educate them in the Roman ways, and by the time they sent them back home, they were ready to serve as imperial administrators, not fight for the freedom and sovereignty and the interests of their actual people. And so this continues today in the form of the U.S. Fulbright scholarship. For Southeast Asia, they have the Young Southeast Asia Leadership Initiative. They have leadership initiatives for Africa, for Central Asia, for Eastern Europe. And this is how they work their way into these countries. Many times these countries don't really have a pipeline for journalists. Local media will actually look for people who went to the collective West to study before hiring them as journalists. But when they begin their job as journalists, they are reflecting Western interests, not the interests of the country that they actually live in and are reporting in. And so this is a huge problem. Again, Russia and China have pipelines for journalism, diplomacy, leadership positions, business, the business community in their respective countries. Many other countries don't, and they need help setting them up. They need to realize that this needs to be set up. BRICS, for example, could create its own version of these very invasive US programs, except do it from the point of view of actually serving the interests of the BRICS nations, not Washington and Wall Street's interests. And so this is a huge problem that needs to be urgently fixed. This needs to become part of the agenda of the BRICS organization, ASEAN here in Southeast Asia, bilateral and bloc relations among the growing multipolar world. But I know so many people who are in positions of power and influence who underestimate just how dangerous this is. This is like a disease inside your country, slowly killing the country. And it does it so slowly that it's very hard to perceive unless you are following it very closely like I am. Now, a lot of people, prominent people in power, people with influence, understand that there will be a considerable amount of discomfort confronting the U.S. and uprooting its interference inside their country. They understand that, and they know that there will be consequences. And they would prefer to appease the United States, buy themselves more time, maybe even convince themselves that this isn't an imminent threat to their nation. And so they will just continue putting it off. The longer you put it off, by the time it becomes obvious you need to do something about it, it's too late to do anything. This is exactly what happened to Libya in 2011. This is exactly what has now happened to Syria. This is what happened to Ukraine in 2014. This is what happened to Georgia in 2003. And so you could do it the easy way or you could do it the hard way. But if BRICS as an organization, if multipolarism as an idea emphasizes protecting individual information space and the collective information space of the multipolar world from the US, which has clearly invested heavily in weaponizing it, to the point where they're still able to overthrow entire countries despite having a military and industrial disadvantage. It should be a priority. And this is why I am trying to warn people once again to take the defense of information space seriously. It is a domain of national security here in the 21st century. Ignoring it, failing to protect it, is the same as leaving your borders open, your airspace unprotected, and surrendering your shores to foreign adversaries. I hope that despite the scale of the tragedy unfolding in Syria, people collectively learn something from this. I could also talk about how last year I warned people that the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel was a trap. I warned people that Hamas is not a legitimate resistance organization. It was deliberately creating a pretext for Israel to flatten Gaza and create conditions permissive across the region for a wider war that has now consumed Syria and now is poised to consume Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, possibly Yemen again. People need to focus on objective analysis. The U.S. understands the nature of human beings very well, and it exploits it at every opportunity, especially people's emotions. The stronger the emotion, the more easily they're able to exploit it. They used people's hatred of Israel and the United States itself to help sell the Arab Spring in 2011. They initially tried to sell it as an anti-Israel, anti-American movement, and people bought it and they supported it, even though the U.S. was behind it years in advance. And they did it again with October 7th, and they will continue doing it for as long as people allow themselves to be provoked and controlled by their emotions. So again, this was a huge tragedy. This is a big loss. It is a battle lost amid a wider war that is still taking place. People need to remember that. They need to learn from their mistakes, and they need to stay focused on the bigger picture. It is not over until it's over. And then even then, history tells us that there is always a chance for redemption in the future. I hope people found something useful in this trying time from this video. If you thought it was useful at all, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It helps the channel grow. It's free to do. Check the video description below for all the other places you can find and follow my work. I post my videos on YouTube,